So, our September series, From Pain to Peace, the path of forgiveness. Powerful, powerful series. As I said last week, we have 5 weeks to move through this process of forgiveness. So, I'm not inviting you necessarily to make that shift all at once, but we're going to take this journey together. So last week, we talked about the default position. We talked about this idea of making love and compassion and understanding, the place that we start from. Because then our reactions immediately change. Then we can immediately begin to interact with our brothers and sisters in a different way and see where they're coming from and bring love to the situation. Powerful. And I took an idea from A Course in Miracles that says forgiveness is the healing of the perception of separation. Because of course, as long as we perceive that we're separated, then we believe we have an enemy and we believe there's another, and so something is wrong with them and everything is right with me. But if we understand that we're one, whatever we're seeing in our brother or our sister is present in us, and that is how we can begin to heal it. So we're in week 2. And the topic for this Sunday is it's time for a revolution. And when I thought about that topic, and as it came to me, what I was thinking about is this idea that forgiveness is a revolutionary act. And so that's why I say it's time for a revolution. And what it took me back to was a blog post that I wrote, about 8 years ago. And at the time, what was happening in this country, there was a brother in California by the name of Stanley Tucci Williams, who was on death row. And after a series of amendments and all of the whole legal process going through, he was finally going to be executed. And everyone was looking to then Governor Schwarzenegger to make a choice, to grant clemency. Now, if you don't know about Stanley Tucci Williams, I just want to tell you a little bit about this brother. He is one of the founding leaders of the notorious gang, the Crips, founded in South Central LA. At the age of 16, he was arrested for stealing a car. He had committed other crimes before then, but he was finally caught and arrested and was held in juvenile detention for a year. And so a year later, at the age of 17, he has a meeting with the authorities and they ask him, well, what do you plan to become? What do you plan to do with your life? And he says, I plan to become the leader of the biggest gang in the world. And so in 1971, he founded the Crips, along with a few friends. Later, in 1979, he was arrested and convicted of murder, killing 4 people. Now, while he was in jail, he went through a number of different circumstances and experiences, but something happened, a shift happened, and he changed. And he began anti-violence work. He wrote 8 children's books, anti-gang books, teaching children that this is not the path that you should take, that this path of destruction, this path of killing is not the way to go. In that time, he renounced his membership in the Crips and apologized for ever founding this organization. He also wrote the Protocol for Peace agreement in 2004 that was part of the truce that was established between the Bloods and the Crips. During his time in jail, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 6 times. Unprecedented. And on December 13, 2005, he was executed. Now, his last words via a radio interview were this: I just stand strong and continue to tell you, your audience, and the world that I am innocent, and yes, I have been a wretched person, but I have redeemed myself. And I say to you and all those who can listen and will listen, that redemption is tailor-made for the wretched, and that's what I used to be. That's what I would like the world to remember. That how I would like my legacy to be remembered is as a redemptive transition. Something that I believe is not exclusive just for the so-called sanctimonious or the elitists. And it is not predicated on color or race or social stratum or one's religious background. It's accessible for everybody. That's the beauty about it. And whether others choose to believe that I have redeemed myself or not, I worry not. Because I know, and God knows, and you can believe that all the youths that I have continued to help, they know too. So with that, I am grateful. I say to you and everyone else, God bless. So take care. Now, really, I could just sit down. Right. because there's some powerful things that he's saying there. He's really speaking to the revolutionary aspect of forgiveness that is accessible to everyone. Even Stanley Tukey Williams, a murderer, even Stanley Tukey Williams, the founder of one of the most notorious gangs in this country, a profound change took place in his life. And there were many of us that were calling, based on that change, Governor Schwarzenegger, will you grant clemency for this brother? And he felt he could not do it. He said that it was one of the hardest decisions that he had to make. Now, what I find ironic about that time period, what we didn't know at the time, were the things that Governor Schwarzenegger was doing in his own life. But this is what's interesting about the path of forgiveness, from pain to peace. See, how could Governor Schwarzenegger forgive or see the good in our brother Stanley Tukey Williams when he could not forgive or see the good within himself? But this is why we are able to talk about this process and understand the revolution of forgiveness, because when I grant forgiveness, I'm not just forgiving that person or that thing or that act. I'm forgiving myself as well, literally. I now make it accessible for me too. If it's accessible for Stanley Tukey Williams, then I know it's accessible for Governor Schwarzenegger. And if it's accessible for Governor Schwarzenegger, I know it's accessible for me. And so I say it's time for a revolution. It's time to stand in this revolutionary act. And I just want to offer two definitions. When we think about revolution and we think about revolting, what does that mean? Well, to revolt means to break away from or rise against constituted authority, as by open rebellion, cast off allegiance or subjection to those in authority. To rebel, there's mutiny, to revolt against the present government. Now, there's several definitions for revolution, and of course, we know the idea of normally a revolution is about overthrowing a government, and sometimes it's about armed struggle. But as I dug a little deeper into the definition of revolution, I found this piece that was interesting to me. It says that revolution is a sudden, complete, or marked change in something. And so what I began to realize is that this path to forgiveness, this path from pain to peace, it requires a sudden or complete marked change. And that's what we're being asked to do. Now, as I was writing that blog post about Stanley Tukey Williams and praying and advocating for his clemency, what I began to understand as I was writing and what I talked about in the blog was that, you know what, this forgiveness thing is really hard. It's a revolutionary act, and when I think about the life of Jesus, I understand now why he was killed. Because he was actually standing as a radical revolutionary. He was standing and letting us know, he was proving that forgiveness is a revolutionary act. But not only that, he was proving that love is power. Because that's all he was doing, he was loving. But there was power. Now, you might say, well, yeah, you know, Jesus, he healed the sick, he did all these things, like he didn't have any guns, there were no weapons. How could that be revolutionary? How could he be called a radical revolutionary? And I just want to offer this idea from our recent history. If you know about the COINTELPRO program that was created in this country to suppress the Black Power movement, there's a famous quote that comes from, literally written by J. Edgar Hoover, and he says that we've started this program to prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Unify and electrify. See, what's interesting, and we must also understand that at this point in time, Malcolm X had already been killed. So he wasn't talking about Malcolm X, right? Elijah Muhammad's power had really been pushed down. He was specifically talking about Martin Luther King Jr., the person who brings nonviolent action to us as Americans, right? That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the person who was talking about, you know, the ballot or the bullet. We're not talking about that person, even though in his own life, Malcolm X was never a violent man, right, himself. But we're not talking about that person. We're talking about the man who was about peace, the man who learned from Gandhi. He was, they didn't want him to unify and electrify using the power of love. So there was a recognition that governments, that those in power, those structures, those systems understand that there's something about this power of love, this power of forgiveness that can unify and electrify people and change things. And so this is what was happening with the life of Jesus. And again, I asked, but again, Jesus wasn't doing anything violent. Jesus gave sight to the blind, the lame walked, the sick were healed, the dead came back to life. Jesus embraced those who were on the margins of society and forgave the sins of even those who were caught in the very act of a so-called sin. And that's why he was killed. It's interesting because you think, well, again, I don't get it, right? And I think what's important is that we have to understand what these sicknesses and what these afflictions represented in that time. Because there was a belief that if I'm lame, there was a belief that if I'm sick, there was a belief that if I have sores covering my body, that I am being punished by God. And there's something wrong with me, that I've done something wrong, and that's why I have this affliction. We talked about that weeks ago when we talked about Job. And this is why his friends kept telling him, man, you did something. You need to figure it out. I don't know what it is, but, you know, all of your possessions are destroyed, and your wife is telling you to curse God and die, and flesh is falling from your bones. God is mad at you, man. You need to figure it out, right? That was a collective belief at that time. And what that meant is that those who were lame, those who were sick, those who were looking for healing were literally living outside of the community, outside of the wall. It was a walled city. And they were placed outside. They were placed outside where the garbage was, where all of the garbage was burned. And just an aside, the word that we get for hell actually speaks to that pile of garbage that was outside of the city. And so anytime you see the word Sheol used in Scripture, it's referring either to just this idea of the underworld, not hell, but an underworld, or speaking to this pile of garbage that was constantly burning. And so as these people who were outcasts, as these people who were on the margins of society, that's where they lived. And here you have this man Jesus telling them that they matter. Here you have this man Jesus saying, you've done nothing wrong. Because see, you have to understand when we talk about power structures and systems, if those that are on the margins, which are always more than those that are at the top, always. If they begin to recognize and understand who and what they are, if they begin to be healed and recognize that there was never anything wrong with them, if they begin to recognize that God was never punishing them, well then they unify and electrify, as J. Edgar Hoover says, and then things begin to change. Those who are in power will lose that power. Now, if you're not convinced still of this idea of what Jesus is doing, I want to take us outside of the Bible. There are lots of ideas and thoughts about where the historical Jesus lies. You can find many different books that look into the life, like, where, you know, what did he really do? Because we don't get a lot of information. We have this fantastic birth. We know about the birth of the manger and all of that, and the star, and the shepherds, and the magi, and all of that. It's wonderful, wise men. And then we don't really hear much, but we know he had to grow up. And then, boom, he meets John the Baptist. He's baptized the dove. This is my son in whom I'm well pleased. And then he has this fantastic 3-year ministry. And we get the highlights of it, right? We don't know what happened day to day. And so there's a lot of information out there about what Jesus did. How did Jesus become Jesus? And one of the things that's fascinating to me is if we look at the possibility that Jesus spent some time in India and in Tibet. And according to the stories, this is where Jesus really learned to heal in the way that he learned to heal. This is where he learned how to go within and center. And if you look at the scriptures, you will find that Jesus always went away for a period of time. That was that time where he was going to sit and meditate and go within, so then he could come out amongst the people and operate fully in his power. And so what's interesting to me is that while he was in India studying and teaching and healing, he had an interesting experience. There's a book, The 9 Faces of Christ, by Eugene Whitworth, and he says something interesting there. He says that Jesus, who, if you go to those scriptures which are written in Pali and are available in Tibet, he's called Saint Isa. And what's interesting also about that word is that the Aramaic word for Jesus is Yeshua. And so that Yeshua, it's the same line in terms of the etymology of the word. So, you know, this word Jesus really doesn't, our English word is just not the perfect word for his name. But Eugene Whitworth writes something deep talking about Jesus' time in India. He says that he taught that all men have right to life, liberty from caste, and such happiness as the flesh may know. He taught that a guru is not essential to help man reach the supreme or the divine. He has taught that there is not one single law which is sacred and divine. He taught resistance to authority and breaking of caste. He taught the taking of food from the lands of the Brahmins, who in the Indian caste system, those were the priests and the scholars, right? To save the lives of the common people at the time of famine. And so what happened, Jesus was critiquing this caste system, which we know exists in India, and there's the idea that when you're in the bottom of the system, this is just my lot in life based on my karma. Again, this idea that I'm being punished, and so I'm at the bottom and I must serve those at the top. And Jesus said, no, actually, you're one with God. No, actually, you're the God being on the earth. You're the Son of God. No, actually, you have power. No, actually, the same power you see in me is present in you. No, actually, you don't need some guru or teacher over you because it's present within you. And so during his time in India, what happened is those in power plotted to kill him. But thankfully, he was able to escape under the cover of night. One of the magi actually was there to help rescue him. And according to the story, that's then when he made his journey back to Jerusalem. And of course, we know the story where he finds the disciples and says, I'll make you fisher of men. And he begins to teach them these secret things that he had learned. And so, again, I say that forgiveness is a revolutionary act. And we are being called and being asked to stand as our elder brother Jesus did, to be radical revolutionaries on the earth, to take this idea of forgiveness, recognizing, I shared a few weeks ago, I think this is when we were talking after the George Zimmerman trial, this idea from A Course in Miracles that a jailer is not free, for he is bound together with his prisoner. He must be sure that he does not escape, and so he spends his time in keeping watch on him. The bars that limit him become the world in which his jailer lives along with him. And it is on his freedom that the way to liberty depends for them both. See, we can live in unforgiveness. You can do that. But you're going to be a jailer with a key standing in front of the jail, making sure that that person that you want to keep in prison never gets out. But what does that mean? It means you're in prison too. Which, again, is so very similar to what I believe Governor Schwarzenegger was experiencing in that moment. Because he was in prison and couldn't see for himself that forgiveness and redemption was accessible. And so, of course, he's not going to see that it's possible or accessible for Stanley Tookie Williams. But I love this last sermon, if you will, from Stanley Tookie Williams. He's reminding us that forgiveness is for everyone. And it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how you grew up, where you were raised, it doesn't matter what your color is, it doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank or don't have in the bank. It's available to us all, and that's why it's revolutionary. Because if everybody was forgiven, well then everybody would be free. I remember my seminary professor, he told us something profound. He said, one of the hardest things for human beings to do is to let each other be free. Like when you think about it, that's so much of what's going on. If we just allow each other the ability to really be free, well, what kind of world would we live in? Everything would be different immediately. And that's the difficult place that we're in. That's why it's revolutionary. So I say it's time for a revolution, yes, but not an armed struggle. Yes, it's time for a revolution, but not by sending missiles into Syria, President Obama. Yes, it's time for a revolution. It's time for a revolution in our families and in our workplace. It's time for a revolution on the subway. It's time for a revolution in all of our areas of lives, but most importantly, it's time for a revolution within ourselves. Because again, that's what it's about, freeing ourselves. That's why I have no problem saying I forgive you, even when it seems difficult, because I know I'm freeing myself. And we must start from that place. And I want to share a story. I'm kind of going extra biblical today, saying Isa, the beautiful thing of Jesus in India. Well, there's another text. Again, if you look at the life of Jesus, you know that Jesus grew up in what's called the Essene community, which was a mystical, Gnostic Jewish community. And they lived, we found older documents now in Qumran. They had a community. There's a lot of things. They were just like amazing people and understood a lot about God and about life and how to manipulate our environment. And so Jesus and his cousin John the Baptist grew up there and they learned. This is where they learned the Torah, learned the scriptures. And in the Essene community, there are several gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. One of those is the Gospel of Peace. And there are 3 books, the Gospel of Peace, and they were translated in the early 20th century. And I love the Gospel of Peace because it gives us a picture of Jesus that we rarely see. What's interesting to me about the Gospel of Peace is we use the verse in Corinthians, love is patient, love is kind. Well, that verse is in the Gospel of Peace. And it actually makes more sense to me that Jesus is the one that would say those words and not Paul. Because there's nothing else in the life of Paul that really adds up to him understanding that love is the more excellent one, that love never endures. But that's what Jesus was saying constantly. So it makes sense to me that, oh, those were words of Jesus that were just misplaced. And so in the Gospel of Peace, there's a story about the prodigal son. Now, we've all probably heard the story of the prodigal son, this guy who told his father, I want my money now, I want my inheritance now. And he goes off and spends all his father's money. And then he ends up not having any more money and has to work as a servant. And of course, he eventually comes back to his home and his father forgives him. And it's a beautiful story, but what's interesting is that in the Gospel of Peace, it tells a very different tale of the prodigal son. Now, that word prodigal means wasteful. So we're talking about the wasteful son. What it points this picture of, if we think in our modern time of a rich kid that has everything and knows that daddy will always save him, right? Well, that's who this prodigal son was. His father was rich, and so he did whatever he wanted to do. He would go out and party, and he would, borrow money from people and say, oh, I'll pay you back, and he wouldn't pay him back. And so then his father would take care of it. Whatever happened, if he destroyed things, his father would come in and take care of it. And he knew that. He's like, I'm rich because my dad's rich and I can do whatever I want to anybody without regard. But then there came a day when his father was like, you know what, I can't keep saving him in this way. And so his father refused to pay his debt. And so the way things worked in that time was that, well, the only way to repay your debt was through working. Was through hard labor. And the amount of debts that he had amassed required him to work this hard labor for 7 long years. Well, in his first week of labor, he almost lost his mind. And he got to about the 3rd day, and he's like, my bones hurt. I'm not just tired, my bones hurt. Every fiber of my being hurts. And he goes to the person that he owes the money. He's like, is there anything we can do? And this is just terrible. He said, well, you should have thought about that when you were living the way that you were living without regard for anyone, place, person, or thing. You should have thought about that. Because now you got to move through this process. And he begins to work and begins to work. And he gets to the 7th day. And he's just feeling terrible, but he's also feeling remorseful. And he goes back to his father and he says, Father, please, I know all the times that I took advantage of your love, your kindness. The fact that I knew you would always save me, the fact that I knew you would always show up. Please, just give me just another chance. And of course, his father is full of love. His father loves his son. We know that because that's why he was doing all the things that he was doing constantly. And his father says, okay, I'll take care of it. And he takes care of the debt, and his son is so excited, he's so elated, that he promises his father, he says, I want to pay the money back to you. I want to work for you. And his father says, okay, well, here's my land, I want you to oversee it, oversee the servants and the cattle, and see what you can do. And according to the story, he begins to work, and he's kind to the servants, because he understands now what that labor is. He understands what that means, and so he's kind to the servants. And he's kind to the land, and the land begins to yield more fruit than it's ever yielded before. And according to the story, he actually is able to repay his father 10 times above what he had originally created a debt. And his father says, "Oh, my son, I'm so pleased with all that you're doing. Here's even more." And what does he do when he receives more? Well, then he goes to everyone who ever owed him anything that he knows they cannot pay him back, and he forgives the debt. He forgives the debt. He washes it clean. And he gives gifts to the servants. And he honors them and he cherishes them. The thing I love about that story is he remembered to forgive because he was forgiven. See, forgiveness is a revolutionary act that can change anything. And we see the path of that. Because his father forgave him even when he didn't deserve to be forgiven. Right? He had technically used up all of his father's goodwill. Right? He had used up all of the love of his father. And still forgiveness was available to him then. And then he recognized that he has people that are in his debt that owe him something. That have done something wrong. And he forgives. And as I've said before, when we forgive, well then everybody's free. And that is a revolutionary act. Our world changes. Because that's what revolution does. We talk about the revolution in this country. Everything changed after the American Revolution. We can talk about the revolution of the Civil Rights Movement. Everything changed after that revolution. But what I understand and know that in this moment where we are on this globe is that armed struggle is not the way. Beatings and killings and jailings is not the way. But it is time for a revolution. So I invite you all to stand in this moment. As we recognize that it is time for a revolution. We recognize that it is time for a revolution in our country. It is time for a revolution in our families. It is time for a revolution in the workplace. It is time for a revolution in every area of our lives, and we recognize that that revolution will come by forgiveness. We recognize that that revolution will come by reconciliation. We recognize that that revolution will come by redemption. We recognize that that revolution will come by love unconditional. We recognize that that revolution will come by love unending. We recognize that that revolution will come by love eternal. And so in this moment, we look at our lives. In this moment, we look at every place in our lives where we are harboring even a hint of unforgiveness. And as we hold that person, place, thing, or experience in our minds, we say now together, "I forgive you." As we hold ourselves in mind, recognizing all of the horrible things we may have done in our lives or that we judge to be horrible, we say to ourselves in this moment, "I forgive you." And as we stand in this vibration of forgiveness, we feel the room shifting. We feel ourselves shifting because we feel ourselves being lifted up by the willingness and courage to believe that love is the more excellent way, by allowing ourselves to believe that compassion and understanding and reconciliation is the only way that we can change or shift our experience. Yes, there are horrible things happening in the world. Yes, there are people being wronged in our lives and in our immediate experience, and we know that love is the only thing that can heal it. Because we recognize, as the Course teaches so clearly, that every act of fear, every act of violence, every act of attack is simply a call for love. So collectively we raise up the temperature on love. We turn up the volume on love. We turn up the volume on our light and erase all darkness. My God, I am grateful and thankful for the radical revolutionaries that are in this space and that are listening to this message. The radical revolutionaries that will prove by their very own lives that love is power. That will prove by their very own lives that peace is power, that will prove by their very own lives that compassion is power, that will prove by their very own lives that trust and surrender is power, because we understand that it is not by our might, it is not by our strength, it is not by our individual power that these things will change, but it is by the power of you, Mother, Father, God, who are working in every situation, even when we can't see it or understand it.
Yes, yes.
And so we release the how unto you. Yes. We release the steps unto you, because we know that you live in a world of infinite possibilities. We know that all things are possible with you. We know that all things are possible as we believe. We know that all things are possible as we know that love is a more excellent way. And for this, we are so grateful as we begin to witness the power of forgiveness in our lives and the power of forgiveness in our world. Together we simply say amen.